Okay, we're live. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to another Breaking Into Data session. I am Aaron Falus, your host, founder of Promotable, and your host for every Breaking Into Data session. With us today, we have Daniel Grennell. So really deep experience. I'm really excited to chat all about data stuff and building teams and what it looks like to hire and all the stuff they don't tell you before you join a boot camp or a master's degree or whatever. And also we have Scott Adams. Scott's also a director over at Northwestern Mutual on the data science side. So really excited to have him join the conversation as well. And with that, just a couple of quick announcements. For those of you who haven't already seen it, check out next week's event as well. We're going to be diving into the technical interview process. So how to approach those, how to answer them. As we have Simon, who was a speaker on a panel a couple months ago, really good senior data scientist at Provi. So for those of you who are still on, feel free to check that out. And also, of course, Promotable. What do we do? We're here to help close the data skills gap, and we do that by helping to connect you with practitioners like our guest today. But every single time, it's always people with deep experience all across the data space. And of course, for those who want to go deeper, we have our data courses as well. We have those for data for business course for those of you who are kind of like me. You might be in marketing or ops or in product, and you want to add to your toolkit. And then, of course, we have a course as well for those of you who want to break into data after completing that boot camp or master's degree. That will be launching in Q2 next year. So if anyone's interested, feel free to come say hello. Feel free to say hello anyway. That said, please get your questions ready. Throw them into the chat. We'll get to them as soon as we can. And with that, let's hand it off to Daniel. Really excited to chat tonight.
Cool. Thanks for having me, Aaron. Appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Cool.
Yeah. Do you want to go and just tell us a little bit more about your background, how you broke into data, how you moved on from Scott, should I just drop you off? Or there you
go. Camera difficulty.
But yeah, so kind of like background, how you broke in, what you do now, what Policy Genius is. We'll go from there.
Cool. Yeah. No. Really appreciate it. Yeah. So I guess I'll start from the beginning about how I got into data. So I think like going back into when I started my career, I started my career in a somewhat different space. I started in operations management, supply chain, logistics, industries like that. And what I thought, and that's even what my undergrad was in, to be honest. And one thing that I really discovered about myself as I was in that career, and I started, doing things like managing people and being accountable for things, et cetera. One thing I thought I liked was number one, the ability to solve problems. And then number two, the ability to be able to objectively solve problems and back myself up with data. So I started getting into things like statistics, Six Sigma, and some of those more like statistical like problem solving methodologies. And at some point while I was early in my career, I also went back to school to get a master's in industrial engineering. And so that also had a ton of math with it. Different kinds of math, more engineering math for sure, but lots of calculus, lots of like classes like that were super valuable in like understanding how to solve different kinds of problems with math and data. And then I went back to school for my second master's at one point, and got that in statistics and focused in machine learning, which, I think all of those degrees, in hindsight, I think they all worked well for me, but it doesn't mean everybody needs to have 3 degrees to work in data. It's just is what it is. That's just my career pathway, and I pivoted careers a couple of times. But yeah, so I started learning how to solve more problems with data and statistics, and they eventually moved into like more analytics-based roles. So back when I started working in the data space, it was kind of pre-data science, and it was more focused on analytics, analysis, and things of that nature. And then eventually, like the industry started shifting more towards like data science, which is really like just the merger of analytics, statistics, and computer science all in like one field, which was super fascinating. And that's where like my machine learning background and other types of like predictive modeling and algorithms that I've been employing really came into play. Yeah, so obviously I started off my career like everybody else, just working for a company, and eventually I worked my way up into management in the ops space. Eventually I moved into analytics management. And then from there, over the past 10 years, data science was one of those things that started becoming interesting and exciting. And there was always a mix of like older companies looking to hire on like talent to help them build out their analytics infrastructure. And then there was like eventually like startups that came along that were super big on the data side as well and really having data as a product. So I kind of had through my career, I've had a mix of those two types of experiences. I worked for some pretty large companies and standing up data science and analytical practices, and that is in automotive, publishing. And I've also worked for a couple startups where I've done basically the same thing. One thing that's been constant through my career in the types of companies I worked for is I found that I tend to like drive towards companies that have an actual product that's not data and then use data to kind of drive and inform that product. And sometimes it's a physical product as well, which is super interesting. So that covers like experience. And so eventually I got into where I'm at now, which is at Policy Genius as the head of data. And so, you know, I've stood up quite a few data teams in my career here, and they all are kind of like architected somewhat similarly. So the data team that I have stood up in the past and I stood up here at Policy Genius kind of consists of like 3 different functions. This is how I define data. And so my title, you know, is like head of data, not head of data science or something like that, which means like my scope is quite wide. Yeah, but it's just like, oh, data, just you're in charge of data. It's like, oh, cool, thanks.
Everything, yeah, the entire company.
Yeah. So, but anyway, the way I set up my role here is exactly the same as I set up the role at like when I was VP of data science or in charge of other like analytical functions, and that I usually tend to define like a data organization that's having like 3 main pieces to it. One piece is data engineering. So basically like the orchestration and architecture and infrastructure you need to drive insights and like empower people to self-serve. 2 would be our data analytics and analysis groups. So these are like our data analysts. These are people that are directly embedded into places like product teams or business teams. And they're working on, you know, not only just building dashboards, but also like trying to drive strategic decisions with statistical analysis, advanced analytics, and other types of like data science problem solving with the purpose of inference, really. Almost every company I've worked at, they have questions on a daily basis. And it's nice to have the space dedicated for people to be able to dive in, answer those questions, dig deep, and support their stakeholders in that fashion. And then the third part of my data groups has been the data science piece, which I just call data science. But really what it translates to is the machine learning piece. So these are the folks that are building those production algorithms that are going to go into a process, a product, a software stack somewhere. Everything they build is meant to be implemented. It's meant to be production, and it's meant to automatically drive a process in some fashion. So that's the nature of the groups I've stood up in the past. Now, jumping over to Policy Genius for a second, because I want to talk a little bit about what we do here at Policy Genius. So Policy Genius is a tech startup, and we're based out of New York City. And we're technically a financial services company, and our biggest products are insurance. So we sell life insurance, home and auto insurance. And what really makes our product and business different from other like insurtech companies you might see out there is we really lean heavily into like the unbiased education and advice. Yes, we are a marketplace. Yes, we do compare prices and show you quotes across a wide variety of carriers. But that's really where a lot of our value adds differ from other insurtech companies out there. We have a large army of licensed insurance agents that work with you every step of the way to get your insurance policy in place. And what they're really good at is, number 1, making recommendations to you about what you really need. Number 2, not trying to push you into products. And number 3, like demystifying the insurance industry and the jargon that you hear when you try to buy insurance. I'm sure all of us can resonate with like trying to buy a policy and like we see this like really weird like coverage line, or like, do I really need that? And questioning that for a second.
Yeah.
So our agents really like fill that role and like being the interface to our customers and helping them get to the right policy. And that's really important when you're trying to buy life insurance, which is a big purchase. But also relevant when you're trying to buy home and auto insurance and just have questions about what you need. So that's a service that we offer. And so data is a key piece of what we do here. And I kind of mentioned the team structure that we set up here. And that's kind of how we're set up to kind of service the organization, is through building the right infrastructure and architecture to try to surface data for our analysts, data scientists, and stakeholders to use and try to action. Using data to do inference and analysis to try to make decisions to optimize our business. And then the third piece of that is building algorithms that work to optimize our business. So I think that's the high level overview.
That's awesome. And I'm actually really happy that you broke it down that way, because I think one of the things that, at least a pain point that I see so frequently, is we kind of just lump it all into data science, but like we don't actually break it down. Because for me, I'm a business junkie, so I'm like, I care less about the algo as long as it works, and more about all the other stuff. But you know, one thing I will say before I forget, folks, I did put their careers page in the chat here. Daniel mentioned earlier that they are actively hiring in the data, in particular data roles, in particular, I think senior analysts are one area of need, but I think I saw 15 jobs on there across the spectrum. So whether it's, kind of first data job or a more experienced data engineering, what have you, go check them out. You'd be working for someone, I assume, Daniel, one form or another. So you get to actually get to experience who you might be working for. So if you do have questions, feel free to throw them out there. This is like the best time, and probably a few times that you'll have the opportunity to do that. Now that I can get off that soapbox. But yeah, I think there's like a couple things I'm kind of curious about. Obviously, like we're here to talk about what they don't tell you about jumping into data. I think one area that I think you could provide a lot of context in, just because you've worked at huge companies or old school companies. I saw VW somewhere on there, and then startups. Is there I think we can start with like what the difference is, both as like an individual contributor and then also when you're standing up a team. If you can dive into like some of those details. Yeah,
totally. I'll also try to hit on the point you brought up about like big companies versus startups, because there is a massive difference, especially if you're looking for that first gig. So like IC versus like building and leading a team. So we could start there. So obviously as an IC, the beauty of being an IC is that often you're very scoped and you're very driven towards specific problems. And so your job is to take in, basically build relationships with your stakeholders and partners, take in requests, scope those requests, and then do things like design analysis plans or analytical plans based on how you're going to solve something. I'm talking more from a data analysis perspective in this case, but it's similar like in the data science space, where when you have a use case, like a large part of the job is scoping that use case and trying to figure out what the heck you're going to build. So a large part of that relationship and a large part of the job is, number one, just getting context from the people that you're working with, trying to understand the business and trying to understand what the actual needs are. Number two is to then like build out and scope what the actual like deliverables and things that you can actually contribute value to are, and to align on those with your stakeholders, and to overlay that data kind of perspective on top of that. And then the third thing is really the execution and delivery of your analysis or the output of whatever it is that you're building. And then getting your stakeholders to ingest, decision, or buy in to whatever it is that you built. So you might have mentioned, like when I talk through that, there's a lot of like talking to other people, which is super valuable. So I think one thing that like boot camps and other places won't tell you is like 99% of your time is not sitting at your computer coding. Unfortunately, a lot of it is like really understanding the business, the context, what you're trying to do, what you can do. Eventually, as you increase in seniority and you learn more of the business, becoming a thought partner to your stakeholders and really helping to bring a data-driven perspective to what they do. So a large part of the job is really just like talking to stakeholders, understanding their problems, figuring out ways we could solve those, scoping what those problems are, execute.
Sorry to cut you off, but when you're kind of going through that scoping process, how often, or is it common for someone to come and say, "Hey, I want you to find some problem, right? Help us make more money." I assume is mostly what they ask, and you're like, "Well, I don't know if data works that way. I can't do that, but maybe you could try it out." Or maybe obviously not so flippantly, but how often do you have to like really kind of either adjust either the expectation or change or refine the question, or and are stakeholders receptive to that?
Yeah. So you kind of hit on another skill that like is not taught very often, which is like the ability to like drill in with stakeholders, understand their perspective, and then try to get them to scope and frame their questions through detail. So the worst kind of data questions are kind of twofold. One is give me XYZ metric or data. Two is
how is that going?
two is what you said. Yeah. Oh, like go make us more money. Like tell me how to make more money. And I read an interesting article about that second one recently, which I thought was a really interesting thought process. Basically, like the quality of the data analysis that you produce and get out is like highly dependent on the quality of that question and understanding, and make sure that question is actually actionable. So tell me how to make more money isn't exactly a very actionable question. Obviously, like you don't really need data to answer that question. Number one, stand up and narrow product line. Number two, try to increase prices. Number three, increase marketing. There you go. 3 ways to go make more money. It's not very useful.
Nailed it.
So what's really useful there is like getting really good at iterating with those stakeholders and understanding their pain points. There's multiple ways to do that, right? Yeah. One is through just understanding the process or the business they own and like the steps they walk through. So like living a day in the life and really try to see like the struggles and decisions they need to make. So that's one way of doing that. A second way of doing that is really like to dive into their strategy and objectives and things of that nature, and then really trying to work on like super scoped questions with them. So I think like what it is, and all the times where I like to start is like, tell me what your pain points are. Tell me things that annoy you on a regular daily basis, or things that you wish you kind of knew that you can kind of react to. And that's like really the key in scoping, is like trying to tie it back to some type of action they can take. And this is a really good way to pulse check if you have a really, really good question is, if I produce an analysis that gives you a metric and the metric shows it's going up, what do you do with that information? How do you react to that? How do you make a decision? How do you action that? Versus like if it goes down 5 points, right? So kind of like walking through those like what if scenarios with people is also a really good way to figure out if you have something that's somewhat usable. So I think that's the best piece of advice I think I can give without running into a very more specific situation, is like try to understand process, try to understand pain points, and then try to get to that really scoped question that you feel like, hey, if I knew the answer to this, I could go do X, Y, Z. So that's another mistake I think sometimes people lean into, is they misinterpret or like they think first of, oh, give me data, then I'll figure out what to do, versus here's my hypothesis and what I think I should do. How do I support that and make that decision with data? And that really gets into like strategic problem solving and those other types of skills that are really important for your stakeholders to know and for you to be aware of, so you can partner with them.
Yeah, no, it's funny that you mentioned specifically that, like, tell me what you hate doing, and how we solve that. That's essentially how I got into even like looking into like, how do I get data skills? Because that was that first, and I was like, I hate doing this one thing. I hate having to ask you all the time. Tell me what you do, so I could learn to do it.
Yeah. Now I come at that trying to answer it from like a more like junior analyst perspective, but like people like me, I'm more demanding, where I'm going to go like, hey, let's take a look at your strat plan. Let's look at what your objectives are, and like let's try to map those to initiatives that you can actually like support.
That we're actually doing. Yeah, no,
that's try to optimize your business. Yeah, so
that's actually one thing we haven't really talked about, is like, I mean, I think you're depending on your level of seniority, you're going to have a different level of interaction with stakeholders. But I'd say a good question for folks who are a little bit more junior: who would their stakeholder be versus like your stakeholder, right? Because it's going to be very different people, I assume.
Yeah, so that's a great question. So the way to answer that question, it really depends on how your team is set up, and that comes back to the big versus startup company dynamic. So in big companies, what could happen is you could be sitting in a specific department. You could be sitting in what's called IT. You could be information technology for folks that haven't worked at big companies. That's what they call it, and it's just like these massive monoliths that exist. Yeah. So if you're in a big company, it is highly likely you could be sitting either in like a business function or in IT. And there's differences in who your stakeholders are and how you're actually distributed into the organization in that fashion. So if you work in IT, you're often like very project focused. So your stakeholder is going to differ project to project, and it depends on what your project is and who is like accountable for that project. And often what that translates to is like you don't get a lot of context about specific business functions. You're really hyper focused on a specific problem and trying to solve that. If you work in a business function, often your stakeholders might be other folks within that business function. So if you're in marketing, a lot of times you might report up to a manager or sometimes even the CMO who was trying to give you direction and insight and like a vision for what their business function is trying to achieve. Now, in the startup life at Policy Genius and other startups I've been at, and I'll actually map this to more product-focused companies, we are structured a little bit differently. We use a philosophy called structured embedding, in which we're going to build basically little data pods that we're going to allocate to different pieces of the business, but we maintain a central data team. So everybody technically reports up to the data team, but they're embedded into these business functions with that triumvirate of data engineering, data analysis, and data science. And their stakeholders are either product managers from the team they're embedded on from the product, or if they work in a business, it might be specific leaders from that business, like a marketing director or somebody like that.
Interesting. Yeah, it's huge. Obviously, I think one thing that I like to try and talk about here is that there's no like right answer. It's always it depends. But also understanding what it depends means, right? And all those different areas is super important.
And before we jump into some of the questions coming up, I also wanted to hear a little bit more about the difference between the individual contributor role and management, because you talked a lot about stakeholders talking to people.
Yeah.
And I mentioned, there's some overlap with a management role, but besides that overlap, how is the role different from a management perspective than I see?
Yeah, good question. And you're right. We didn't answer that part of the question. We got a focus in one area. Yeah, so that's a great question. So as an IC, like your job is basically execution. And as you increase in seniority, basically mentorship. When you're a manager, your role kind of flips flips to less of a focus on the actual execution of things and more on that mentorship, relationship building, partnership building, and being that like senior person to help drive your ICs to actually deliver. So, and then as you increase in management, like your scope gets even wider and wider, right? So I'm accountable for the vision of the whole data capability at Policy Genius. I have a director under me that supports a specific part of our team. He's accountable for the vision for his section of the data team, and we try to map those things up together. And then obviously if you have a manager underneath that manager would be responsible for their very specific focus and the growth mentorship of their team and their analysts or data professionals. And then being that thought partner and senior leader to other key stakeholders across the business. And so when I interview like management candidates, basically I tell them, hey, there's two parts to your job. I'm gonna make it sound really easy. Grow, lead, and mentor a team. Be a thought partner. That's basically your job in a nutshell. Yes, it's helpful if you can code and you're technical because you can coach people better like that. But we don't expect it to be like delivering analysis on a daily basis. And there's a mix of management. Some managers are more technical. Some managers are more like, I don't want to call them qualitative, but they're more focused on the coaching and the mentorship and like empowering people. And I think it really depends on who you are as a manager that drives or dictates which of those areas you tend to lead heavier into. It's typically hard to find people that are really strong technically, and then super strong on the coaching and mentorship side. So sometimes you get a spectrum there.
So do you still code then in the new role, or?
I code more than you would think, and I think that's just my personality. I probably actually write too much code. I try not to push any of it, but I do a lot of like analysis and stuff like that when I'm trying to solve like top level business problems with some of our executives for sure. Yeah.
What about like building out a data capability? And this will be my last question before we jump into some of the stuff on there. But what are like some common mistakes, or I think you probably learned the hard way, building data capabilities? What are the common things that companies might get wrong or don't do right the first time when they're first standing up their first data org, I guess?
I think some of these are opinions, observations, and there could be different rationale for some of the things I'm going to say.
You're one data point.
Yeah. In my personal opinion, I think one mistake people often make is over-indexing on architecture and infrastructure. Sometimes you need to do that because like you literally start with 0, but sometimes you might have like the bare bones of a data warehouse setup or something like that. So a lot of times, like I'll talk to like people that have set up teams like, oh yeah, we spent the first like 3 years building out the data warehouse. And it's like, is that really the best way to spend time spending that capability and show value to the company? I don't think so. So I tend to take more of a split tracked approach in that, yes, I think infrastructure and architecture is important. And again, spectrum here, because if you're starting with nothing, you got to build it. But if you have the bare bones of something you can start with, often like it's great to like parallel path. Hey, I'm going to build out infrastructure and architecture to make our team more efficient. But also, what are some really low-hanging fruit use cases and pain points from some stakeholders that can start solving and building that credibility and trust with those folks? So when I'm ready to come in and embed deeper, they're willing and able partners that are have seen the benefits of some of the things that we can do with data and are willing to come and partner with us in general. So that's one thing that I often see as far as like mistakes or what I think are mistakes or things that people do differently. I think another thing I've learned in the past is, and this is really hard because it really depends on like your scope, what resources you allocate, et cetera. But if at all possible, hire managers earlier, sooner rather than later. And I say that because it's way too easy to get overburdened or to have eventually way too much to execute or control on your own, especially in a large organization. So the faster you can like build out and hire those force multipliers that can actually help you hire and do things like that, your life is going to be so much better. So that's another recommendation I would make. I think the third thing is kind of along those lines, but not necessarily managers. Focus on hiring senior roles first, if that makes sense. So if you're hiring data analysts, try to get like a more senior data analyst that can drive projects on their own or comfortable with ambiguity, comfortable with taking on the load of like a newly forming team. That way you can lean in a little bit less, but also you're able to build, again, some more force multipliers that will be more effective. So I think those are a couple of like the mistakes I've made in the past. And I would love, I have corrected some of those and would correct more in the future. But yeah, I think those are 3 main things.
Those are all really good. I mean, some of those, like you see, I have a friend who's also in a small startup, but they're probably they haven't raised capital yet, but if they would go to raise, it'd be like a Series A type company. And when I see people who have like 15 or 20 direct reports, and I'm like, you wonder why you don't sleep. Like, it's like you spend all day, you have like a weekly hour meeting with every person, and then you still have to do the rest of your work, right? It's insane. So yeah, I've seen that first in terms of like how it breaks. So yeah, not that I'm an expert by any means, but from my perspective, it totally makes sense. Okay, so just kicking off the Q&A portion here. We'll start with a softball. Jason Poe asked, what are the best parts of working at Policy Genius?
Thank you for the softball first. Appreciate that. Here's my bat. I'm going to knock it right out of the park. So the really great thing about working at Policy Genius is I think there's a couple things there. Number one, I think the mission and vision of the company is fantastic. I, for one, have had very frustrating experiences buying insurance and not knowing if I'm buying the right thing or being super uncomfortable with what I am buying. So I often would spend a lot of time going across different sites, reading way too much, and the stuff you read out there is not very interpretable. So I really like the mission, the vision, and like trying to make the purchase of insurance a more seamless experience, make it suck less, to be honest. And then like to make sure to give you that comfort that you're getting the product that's going to protect you and your family if something bad were to happen. So that's one positive thing about Policy Genius. I think the second thing I really like about Policy Genius is actually I was trying to pick mentally, but Policy Genius was already a pretty data-driven company when I got here, and so what was great is we had some bare bones of a data warehouse. Stakeholders were craving to use more data to make decisions with, and so I found it easy to like build some trust and to not have to sell what we can do with data. It's really been a unique challenge from other companies I've been at, where like a lot of times like part of the job is like selling what you can do.
Well, why are we paying you all this money, and why are you a team? Yeah,
yeah, exactly. But
you probably should have thought about that before you did it.
Yeah, but in Policy Genius' case, it's really more around just trying to catch up and scale fast enough to support people that are willing and hungry, and we're still trying to scale even though we've been doing this for a year and a half now. It just takes time to build those teams and to build those partnerships. Yeah, so I think those two things I really do like about the company in general. Yeah.
How big is the data team? Out of curiosity.
Good question. I don't remember the exact number, but we're about
approximately more or less, plus or minus.
We're about
number.
15, 16, 17 now.
Yeah, good size, but not crazy.
Yeah, and we have Connect for Rules open too. So definitely like check them out. And we're like, I've been hiring nonstop since I got here, and I got some managers that I've hired as well. They're also hiring. So there's tons of roles and availability out there. So feel free to check us out.
Awesome. Here's a good kind of question that goes back to talking to stakeholders. And Daisha, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name. Feel free to correct me on the chat. She just asked, how do you set expectations with internal clients or stakeholders? Because I think that you kind of just mentioned something very similar. It's like a lot of people don't really know what data is, or, so they say, oh, we want a data scientist, engineer, whatever. They have no idea if that's what they need. They kind of just say we want it. It's like, I talk to people all the time and they'll say like, oh, let's hire a data team. And I'm like, but really you just need like some Excel people to learn like basic SQL and you're probably good to go.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, I think there's multiple levels to Daisha's question here, and I see that one in the chat as well. I mean, I think her point is they want like a single person folded across like multiple roles. I think it's critical. So we're at with Policy Genius, we're at a stage where basically what we're concerned about is building that interface with stakeholders, getting their problems, and then our job is to like figure out how to scope and distribute amongst those roles. So we never want our stakeholders to have to come to us and say, hey, I need your data engineer to do this, I need your data scientist to do that. That's not really an effective use of their knowledge or time. Really just want to know their problems. And so that's often how I set expectations with stakeholders is like, I try to like gear them towards, okay, like I don't want to just hand you over things. Like I want to be a value add to what you're doing and help you be successful and contribute to your strategy, and also solve the problem in the most efficient way possible. So let's talk about what your problems are, what decisions you're trying to make, and then we can take those back and figure out how to scope, execute, and run against them. So it all comes back to like that scoping and like problem solving exercise and like brain and building a partnership. And that's really what it is you want to make sure you're not in these relationships where people just tell you what to do and you just do it for them. You really want to build partnerships where you're both are thought partners, and you're coming at this from a data perspective, your partner's coming at it from like a business perspective, and you can meet in the middle with an optimal solution. So I don't know if that's the best answer for Daisha's question, but that's one way to set expectations. Another way I've done that in the past, especially when I form new teams, is I literally have like kickoff decks or like scoping decks that literally lay out what the team is, what we do, and how we communicate with stakeholders, and how we service the organization, and the capabilities and services that we provide. And I think that's super. And actually, I do this with also new people that on board. Is I sit down and tell them about the team, and also like educate them on like the services and things that they should come to us for, and how to come to us and work with us.
Which, I mean, that's actually a great way of doing it, because most of the time we just don't know, right? So hence, then your Slack gets blown up. But
Yeah.
here's what we do, here's what we don't do, and here's how we help you get what you need. I think is a really great approach. Andrew was asking about how he's trying to get into data. Just got a job offer as a systems engineer for Bass Pro. So first of all, congrats. Always good to feel wanted. But he wants to break into data. Is asking if this is a good place for him to start. If it's a good place to kind of get this and then move on from there, or should he hold out? I think that's the question that's not asked. And obviously, you're one data point, so obviously, like, please don't always 100%. But from your perspective, anyway.
Yeah, Andrew, I will try to avoid telling you to go what to do with your specific use case. But I'll try to give you some things that were helpful to me, like when I wanted to break into data science and be a data scientist. A lot of times, like if you look at the career progression of getting to be a data scientist, you either get there in one of 3 or so ways. The first pathway to getting into a data scientist is you go to school for a long amount of time and you get a master's degree in stats, computer science, or a PhD or something like that. And then bing, bang, boom, you can probably go get a data science job. And it's probably like, either a low-level data science job or junior data science job or something like that. But that is one way to get there, is like the academic route. The second way of getting there is like the more applicable route with some supplementation on top of that. When I say supplementation, I mean a little more education. So a lot of data scientists often start their careers going through that data analyst kind of like pathway. The reason why that's beneficial is because you learn how to interact with data systems and databases, write some SQL. You also learn how to solve problems with data and build products, which is super helpful. And then like you're in a place where you can continuously challenge and start expanding your skills into more like data sciencey type skills. What I meant by education supplementation is I think a lot of the misnomers with being a data scientist, especially like how we hire data scientists ourselves, is we care about the theoretical, I wouldn't say as much, but close to almost as much as we care about the execution. And so a lot of boot camps and places like that, they're going to show you how to code, they're going to show you how to pull things off the shelf and how to actually apply those functions. But if you don't know what those functions are doing, you're a less valuable problem solver in that fashion. Yes, you can go execute, but how do you know you're executing the problem correctly? How do you know that you're building a solution that is generalizable and also representative of the problem at hand? So myself, I came through, both a mix of like business background plus like education supplementation through my master's in stats and stuff like that. And there's just tons of like statistics and things to learn to wrap up into data science that is valuable to know about. So that's the other route. And then the third route is like more of an engineer / computer science major that is able to move over into data science. And the reason why sometimes that makes sense is because some companies have different types of roles as well, like an ML engineer, not just a data scientist. So like some folks can make a transition to an ML engineer if they can learn the theory behind some of those algorithms that drive data science. So oftentimes an engineer or computer science major can often like build that knowledge and bridge those gaps and learn more about the techniques used and be able, because they can code really well, they can actually make it to become a data scientist at some point. So those are typically the pathways that you get there. I think the biggest things are, if you're trying to get there at all, is to put yourself in a position where you can solve problems and start like increasing the amounts of like sophistication you undertake in solving those problems. Find a place where you're coding on a regular basis so you can always practice coding and have the ability to do that. And then find ways to supplement your education with theory, learn your statistics, learn how those data science algorithms work and why they work.
That is excellent feedback. Anna asked, which analytical tools do you use most often in your day-to-day, or maybe less in your day-to-day, but maybe in your team's day-to-day?
Yeah.
Maybe you're doing too much of it yourself. We can talk about that.
Yeah, totally. So I'll try to answer this by telling you what our data analysts use and what most analysts use have have used at this team that stood up. So all of our data analysts or data scientists, they know how to code. If now, depending on the company, depends on the language that they're going to look for. A lot of companies really bias towards like Python. You must know Python, and there's reason for that. But the way we stand up our jobs is we really don't care. It's like if you know R, like really we shoot for R or Python. I'm an R person myself, maybe that's why I do that. But we really just want people that can solve problems and understand how to solve those problems. And we try to make language be a little more agnostic, if you will. So tools that are treated for analysts are R or Python. Sometimes people know both, sometimes people know one, it's fine. SQL and understanding how to operate between like data warehouses is important. I think sometimes people are like, oh, I know, like I've used like BigQuery, I've used SQL Server, I've used this and that. It really doesn't matter. It's SQL. So as long as you understand how to navigate a database, it's going to be fine. So it doesn't matter if you use Redshift or you haven't. As long as you've written SQL before in the past, you should be totally cool. And then another tool in the tool belt of data analysts would be some type of like data product or visualization software. And really what that's used for is to just deliver products to stakeholders. And so examples of that would be things like Tableau, Looker, other types of like off-the-shelf kind of BI platforms and software. Yeah, you might do less work in those things yourself, but a lot of like you're going to be building things in there all the time. So it's good to get some reps there.
Yeah, absolutely. Janelle asked an interesting question. When you're first starting out, how do you network or meet other data scientists or people in the data community? Where do you go for that kind of stuff?
So pre-COVID, yeah. So pre-COVID, I used to go to meetups, conferences, and things like that, and that's where I'd meet and network a lot of people. So I think that's really the best way to go is to like find forums like this where you can actually like interact and talk to people and you're able to actually find the time and the ability to introduce yourself. Going to trainings is another good way of doing that. So a lot of times like conferences are great, so are like meetups, but sometimes it's great to go like technical trainings or things of that nature and like just meet other professionals there. And then a lot of times you meet people that are useful to talk to, and you'll exchange LinkedIn information, and it takes time to network. Other options are, if you're not like the outgoing type, and most of the scientists aren't, but if you're not the outgoing type, other ways of doing that are like really drive hard on LinkedIn. Like LinkedIn offers tons of groups. Like you can literally just like search LinkedIn for like groups that are in your interest, and you can be put in a group with a bunch of other like data scientists and like start building some of those connections.
Yeah, I mean, like what I do all the time, just reach out to people and say, hey, I'd love to have coffee or learn about what you do. I'm new in the industry. Like I'm not asking for a job here. I just want to better understand like what I should be doing, what I should be learning about, what it's like to do this in like X industry. Obviously, pre-COVID was a lot easier. You'd go things like in Chicago, we have a group called Built in Chicago that ran a monthly, what they called Built in Brews. So you would go, it would be hosted by some company. So for them, it was a hiring event. For you, it's like you go, you spend a couple bucks, and you get to go meet a bunch of people, and you had some free beer. Well, free, you paid for it, but subsidized beer is a better option. But it's a good way of meeting people that you don't ordinarily run into in your daily life. Here's a fun question. This person's asking for a friend.
Sure.
Exactly. Is there anything for someone who's like interviewing for junior level data roles? Are there things that you like for sure like should be mentioning at like every interview? Or like better question is, when you're interviewing junior level roles, what do you look for? Like what makes you like, you're looking at resumes, you're like boring, and you stop at something. What does that look like? And the follow up is when you're interviewing someone, what are things that people say when you're just like, okay, we're done now? Like, is there any like turn off?
Yeah. Great questions all around. When I'm looking at resumes, what I typically look for, obviously like it depends on the requirements of the job. So like, again, like when we're setting up junior roles, I want to make sure somebody can code, somebody knows some SQL. That's basically what I'm looking for, right? It's a junior role. I don't expect them to have a ton of experience, and that's okay. So some things that catch my eye are sometimes like people trying to break into being a data analyst. And so they'll really like hit their resume with like, okay, I know, here's some of the technology I know, here's some of like the education and courses I've had, and then like my job was XYZ, but here's how I've like applied some like analytical techniques in my current job. So I think what's also important about your resume is like, make sure like you're kind of breaking out some of the projects or things that you've done in the past, whether it's academic or whether it's been a job, and try to relate it to what you're applying for. That is super helpful, because what that helps us do is like to mentally cast and visualize kind of where you're at and what you can possibly do. And it helps become comfortable.
I mean,
yeah,
that's perfect. If you can visualize, how this is like, this person's perfect for this, or I know they can do this, you're good to go.
Yeah, totally.
And then on the interview side, are there things where like either like total turnoffs, or just, I don't know if there's like a particular question you enjoy asking that you're willing to share?
Yeah. I think some of the biggest turnoffs I normally have, so like a couple of things that I tend to look for heavily. Communication's key. So like a part of our interview process is like, you're gonna do a take home, but you're gonna come in and present that take home. And if you stumble through it or just read through the code, it's not going to work for us. Like, we're looking for people that can synthesize and to be able to summarize what they've done, back it up technically, sure, but like, don't just read your notebook. Put some effort into like really trying to get into that like interpretation and explanation and like data. What is that? Just like explaining what you did. So that's one thing. The second thing is when I pinpoint something wrong you did, and you double down on it, or like give me some BS answer about why you did it that's not right. I think what's really helpful that I've seen a lot of like interview candidates do that worked out really well is they tell you things where they were like, they're proactive in telling you where they're unsure or unclear and kind of why they did it, even if they're not entirely sure. And then being super open to feedback, or be like, hey, like if I was really doing this on the job, I would have like worked with somebody and asked somebody, or like spend a little more time here to do some research. But if I pick up on something, I ask you about it, and you don't know, and just try to make up something, that's less helpful. And it's typically a turn off. Yeah,
that's actually a theme that I've had quite a few times.
Yeah.
To go off of that, let's say people are obviously nervous when they're interviewing. It's a stressful process, and they do make a misstep, and there's something you call out that's I think this was a mistake. How does somebody recover from that in the interview process, or is it just over?
I think the way I tend to think about an interview in general, and the way we kind of score interviews, is we have certain capabilities that we're looking for. So sometimes we'll know if you'll have strengths and weaknesses, right? So if you were a killer at communicating and synthesizing and like really like explaining your analysis and what you did, you could code. Even it might not have been the greatest, but you were able to code. And then like, let's say I catch you like not being able to explain something, or you explain it wrong or something like that, I'm gonna weight that down heavier. I'm gonna weight that down a lot less than I would if like you were terrible at communicating and like all those other things, and then you double down on something you did wrong. So like really like it's about the package. So you can recover if you feel like you stumble on something. Just like keep going and like really try to focus on the other skills and places where you do spike.
Yeah, no, that's a great answer. What was I going to say? Oh, jumping into this next one. Joshua is in a master's degree. I think we can broaden that question up and just what should people who are getting a master's in analytics, or however they rebrand their statistics courses now into masters in data science, like what should you be learning now in addition to like the general kind of coursework you're going to be getting in that? I'm sure SQL, Python, but is there anything else that's like that you think someone should be like, oh yeah, this is the thing you should learn now? Obviously, there's not any one thing, but if there was something you wanted to pick and add to there to be one extra data point.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, typically in like programs like that, you're going to get enough experience with like R, Python, using GitHub and all that kind of stuff nowadays. So like, I think like from the technology side, that's fine. I think like in those programs, I think where you're better off like focusing and supplementing yourself are on the theoretical or less technical pieces. Like I think a lot of people over-index towards like, I must know R, Python, I must be able to commit code to GitHub, I can do all those things. What's stopping me? Well, you can't solve a problem. So figure out how to like structure and a frame a problem, walk through it, and what techniques and statistical techniques you should apply to that. So like doubling down that theory, how to structure and solve a problem. Some of those more qualitative things I think are places where I'd recommend like supplementing that degree program. And like if you're going to work in business, really what you want to make sure of is like you're able to connect data and insights to actions and decisions and recommendations that you make to stakeholders. So starting to practice that like when you're in college and school is a great way to get some of that experience.
Yeah, and then we have another question down here. Kind of goes back. You talked about it before, so I'll just summarize the answer. But Michelle asked if boot camps are the most efficient way to get into data science or analyst role, and I think the answer is they can be, but there are other ways of doing it as well, right? If you are already in a company and you can like make a pivot, say get something that's not a data science title but has something data functionally in it, that's a good way to pivot to then get the next role. Or if you have like really deep experience in, I see she asked about logistics, so we'll just make an assumption that she's in logistics. If you have deep experience there, apply for companies that are in logistics, because having domain knowledge is like one nice thing. I know you didn't mention that, but I'll just go on my soapbox and say that's always helpful. And then just going through, because we've got 5 more minutes. Let's see. So there's a couple of questions about folks who are self-taught. That's always a hard one, but I'm not sure if you have experience with like guiding folks who are trying like self-taught, trying to break into a role.
Just general guidance.
Yeah, I mean, there's this is a very long question.
I guess yeah.
I think the general theme is it seems like worried about more of an age thing. Like, I'm in this case 35, but like, breaking in, you'll be looking at like junior roles that are like, someone who's like 23 is applying for. Like, is that like a hindrance? And then there's a question down at the bottom about if you have to have a degree to get a job. I would say on the degree part, no. It's certainly helpful because it shows that you can do certain things and it shows that you went through it and all that. But if you're like an amazing, coder or something, if you have like a really amazing skill set, people don't care as much.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I think back onto the first question about the self-taught like data scientist or somebody like trying to start out. Sometimes some of the most frustrating things can be like, you need some experience to get a job, but how do you get the experience if you have never had the job, right? So it's like this catch-22 of like trying to get your first job, and that's super tough. So I think depending on where you are as a person, obviously you're coming out of college, it's, there's different pathways for getting there. There's internships and things like that. Somebody that's like self-taught and hasn't gone through college and is maybe like further along in their career, I think something you actually said a second ago is really, really good advice, which is like try to find a domain and try to find that domain and space that and try to find a role that is comparable or could map to something that leads to what you're doing. So one way of like learning data analysis and data science is to like take a job that's not exactly that, and then start doing those things as part of your job, right? And you'll be surprised in how many roles like a little bit of data analysis and data science is key. And then once you're in a company, a lot of times it's easier to make an internal transfer or to like really be able to move laterally than it is if you're trying to come in from the outside. So that I think what you said before about like finding that domain that and like trying to index towards that is a great piece of advice. Try to find a job where you can demonstrate some of those skills, circle that experience, and then as you start as you build that experience and knowledge, really try to tailor your resume towards doubling down on that experience and knowledge. And that's another actually good piece of advice is like, make sure you're tailoring your resume towards the jobs you're applying for. So it's not sneaky or tricky. It's like how you actually like get people to pick up on your resume. And so sometimes like you like a lot of times what recruiters will tell you is take keywords from the job postings that you're applying for, fit them into your resume and tailor the narrative to demonstrate the skills that you can do that are part of that job.
Yeah, no, I love that point you made about mapping what you do, because a lot of times, I mean, at this point, I've talked to quite a few people, and most people, it's not like they like left college and got a data science job, right? It's like you were either like an engineer of some kind, you're a PhD of some kind. Sometimes we had someone 3 weeks ago or a month ago who was, I'm gonna mess this up. It was like fictional writing or something for a BA, so. he'll correct me later. But it was something like that. Could have been English literature. I don't remember. But it was like super non-technical, and it was like, in his case, it was like, hey, I did this. I had like some technical skills. I learned, like CSS or whatever they learn in college, right? And nothing special. And then I got this thing where they're like, oh, you should do a little bit of this. Like, you seem to be interested. Like, and kind of like pivoted until I got the title. But that's like the, on the inverse side, as someone who used to hire for startups with no budget, I would do the flip side of saying, hey, I want this title, but I can't afford it. Let me map these roles out, call it something different.
Yeah.
And I mean, I made some good hires though. Obviously, they don't stay, but like they get the title they want, and I get the talent I need. So with that, I think that's all the time we have for questions. Really good questions. Really happy with all the engagement. So again, appreciate everyone coming out. And of course, if you did enjoy this, we really appreciate a like or follow on the promotable page. That helps us. It sounds stupid, but there's a reason everyone does it. So be very, very candid. Again, I'm Aaron Falous. For anyone who wants to connect with me on LinkedIn, feel free. And then do check out all those roles with Policy Genius. I hope this has given you a good perspective on what it's like to work there, who you'll be working for. Not to make any more shameless plugs, but do what you gotta do. And with that, thanks everyone. I'm sure I'm going to get a question. This is being recorded, so we'll get that out to everyone. So if you signed up on LinkedIn, we'll have your email, and we'll share that as well. So if there's anything you missed, you want to get back and watch it again, it's always available. With that, thanks everyone, and I hope to see you all next time.